Yeah, thank you guys for the opportunity to share here. My name is Jeremy Enarson, the middle of the three, with the City of Camrose, my colleagues Sarah Skinner and Anjah Howard. And we're pleased to be able to provide a bit of a background on, I guess, the topic of road salts is just part of what we did. So part of the presentation here is talking a little bit about the development of the Camrose Source Water Protection Plan. Those, you'll see an acronym here shortly. And then, so kind of between Anjah, Sarah, and myself, we'll talk a little bit about how the plan was developed between the city and the county, what the Battle River Watershed Alliance's role was in helping us to actually develop that plan. Generally what the plan looks like, how it was originally developed, how do we actually start looking at applying it, things like that. And then, of course, there's a number of different slides that are specific to road salts, and we'll get into those as we get along the way. So the Camrose Source Water Protection Plan, where did it come from? Well, the city and the county for a number of years, for decades, honestly, we've been working on joint water quality issues, watershed protection issues for a number of years. There have been a number of either formalized agreements or kind of informal ongoing support. The county has had a number of different workshops that they've been hosting with their residents, with ranchers in the area, and the city would partner alongside, recognizing that the runoff from those areas ultimately drains into the Battle River and Dry Meat Lake, which is where the City of Camrose gets our water from. And so because of that interrelationship, the city has come alongside the county, from time to time, helped to sponsor some of their events, provided food for some of their workshops and things like that. And as you can see there, agreements dealing with confined feeding operations for a long time. As things really progressed, we realized that we wanted to build on what we've been doing in the past, and then at the same time, so the city, like I said, we draw our water from Dry Meat Lake, which is on the Battle River. And for the most part, the city takes the water out, treats it, and we provide it for our own residents. We had one major regional water line that provided water to the village of Pigeon Lake. There were a few county residents along the way, and then, as you can see there, in 2010, the city and the county then started to talk a little bit more about other regional water lines, and it was through that process that the city and the county said, you know what, as a part of this agreement, we would like to write into the actual agreement that we're going to work together on what ultimately became the Camrose Source Water Protection Plan. So a process for us to start to work together to talk about how can we work more closely, how can we have a formal agreement that talks about water quality issues within the area there. And that is when we brought in Sarah.
Yeah, so just a brief intro to what we mean when we're saying source water protection. Source water protection is considered to be one component of a multi-barrier approach to drinking water protection. So the other components, of course, being the actual drinking water treatment processes and then also the distribution systems. But source water protection, wanting to get at the source, looking at the watershed scale, at what the various land use activities are that are happening on the landscape and how those activities can potentially affect the quality of your source water for both drinking water as well as many other purposes. So it really is about looking at what beneficial practices can we implement at that watershed scale. This is probably sounding very familiar to a lot of you because it's very similar to overall watershed protection goals, and many benefits of implementing those practices across a watershed. Protecting drinking water sources through, whatever different practices are possible, and many benefits to doing that, both reducing overall public health risks associated with poor water quality, minimizing the cost of treating our drinking water, and then also other benefits such as increasing the recreational value of some of these areas. So overall approach to source water protection there. And then more specifically, the goals and objectives of the Camrose Source Water Protection Plan were to both protect and improve the quality of surface water in the Battle River and more specifically Dry Meat Lake, like Jeremy said, and then the main objectives of the plan itself being to identify those various risks to source water within the planning area, which we'll describe in a bit, and then outlining those actions that we could take to minimize or eliminate the risks that we'd identified. And then actually moving towards implementation of those actions with the goal of supporting safe and secure drinking water and water supplies for many other purposes as well in the City and County of Camrose region. So overall planning process for source water protection starts at the top with bringing people together into the room to talk about these things, defining what your planning boundaries are going to be, conducting a source water risk assessment, and then developing that management plan, outlining those practices that can be taken, and then the evaluation of the plan. All right, so in terms of the Camrose Source Water Protection Plan and who we brought together into the room, the core project team was really the people standing here, helping to coordinate and lead the process, but then also wanting it to be a multi-stakeholder approach, so having an advisory committee that was comprised of both the city and county councilor, and then also wanting to have the agricultural perspective, so bringing in a local ag producer that was right near Dried Meat Lake, as well as a well driller, a few different city and county residents, and then also Ducks Unlimited Canada was involved in the process too. And yeah, we had Battle River Watershed Alliance acting to facilitate the process, and yeah, so the chairperson was not from any one municipality in particular, was selected from the members at large. So the next step in the source water protection plan is to define what actually are the planning boundaries that we're looking at. When it comes to source water protection, in particular surface source water protection, you are potentially looking at the entire watershed upstream of your drinking water intake location. So for Camrose, that would be looking at the intake location in Dried Meat Lake and the entire watershed upstream. So that ends up pretty much being the entire what we call Big Stone subwatershed of the larger Battle River watershed. So you can probably, maybe, see Pigeon Lake included in that zone. And then many other factors that we wanted to consider, one of the main ones was actually looking at the effective drainage area. Oh, sure, speaking loud. Yeah, looking at the effective drainage area in the watershed, especially because the Battle River watershed is a prairie-fed watershed. The area of the watershed that's actually regularly contributing to local lakes, creeks, and the river itself is not the entire watershed. So the gray area that you can see on the map there are those areas of land that are expected to regularly contribute water towards the main stem. And so that was key for just looking at where can we have the greatest impact if we're implementing these different management practices in the watershed. The contributing area is a really important place to focus that attention. But there's also the jurisdictional aspect, which I believe Jeremy will get into next.
So as Sarah mentioned here, rather than looking at the entire watershed, we looked at what we call the effective drainage area. So the area that regularly contributes towards the Battle River and the areas downstream. So the area that we basically took that last map and then only took just the area that was within Camrose County, which is the overall map that you can see here. Although it's cut off on the bottom, and it's kind of a zoomed in area of Camrose County. Looking just at Camrose County, now you can see areas in green. Those are the areas that are part of the effective drainage area that leads into Dried Meat Lake. Because our main concern from the Camrose drinking water perspective is everything that drains into Dried Meat Lake. Not that we don't care about what happens further downstream, but obviously that was we had to remove that as part of the plan. And so basically from the downstream end, close to Edberg, is where you can see the lake in a very fuzzy DML, Dried Meat Lake weir. Basically everything that's in green is upstream of that, drains into Dried Meat Lake. and is considered part of the effective drainage area. And as you can see, of course, the City of Camrose, pretty much almost the entire city limits would be also within the effective drainage area as well. So now that we've established the boundaries of what the plan was going to entail, then it was a question of, okay, how do you actually determine what do you care about? What do you want to look at in terms of considerations? And so I'm sure that, well, we've got a few slides a little bit later that's talking about the risk matrix, the risk assessment process. But we wanted to start, rather than starting from square one, we figured, well, is there anything out there that can help us to start our review? And as it turns out, the City of Camrose, because our drinking water is regulated by the province, one of the restrictions, one of the requirements from the province is that we develop a drinking water safety plan, which, as you can see in the second bullet point there. And so the City of Camrose, one of the things that we're required to do is to basically sit down, and there's 4 main areas: source water, the treatment process, the distribution system, and then at the tap. And looking at all of those different areas, we sit down, the City of Camrose sits down and tries to identify what are all the potential different risks that could impact our ability to treat water and provide safe drinking water to our customers. So treatment, distribution, and at the tap, of course, are a little bit outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. That first area of the source water, that became the starting point for our discussion within the larger group here. And so ultimately what we did was the City of Camrose had previously started to develop started to identify a number of potential risks on the source side of things. We brought that to the committee and we said, we're not necessarily experts of what's happening out in oil and gas, agriculture, other areas. So we asked for input from the committee members. We basically fleshed that out and got a look significantly more potential risks that are out there on the source water side of things. And then ultimately, as you can see in the bottom bullet point there, we tried to figure out, okay, what is the relative risk? And we, as a committee, sat down and said, do we think it's a high risk, low risk? What are the factors? And ultimately, that led to saying, yes, we should put a lot of effort in here, or this is a thing we need to be aware of, but not spend a lot of time and effort on trying to manage. For anybody that's been involved in this type of analysis before, you'll see various versions of these. And so this is basically just a matrix, a spreadsheet that we sit down and identify across the top. What is the potential impact? And so if something did happen, is this insignificant, like you wouldn't really notice it in your terms of your water quality, or would this be catastrophic in nature? So it could result in significant loss of life, things like that. So you can, along the top axis, you can identify the potential impacts. And then along the right, on the left-hand side, is the likelihood. And so this is something that's going to happen very infrequently to something that's almost certain to happen within the next few years. And so that's ultimately we multiply the two numbers together. You can kind of identify which ones are going to be the ones you focus on. Of course, those are going to be the ones in the yellow and in the red. The ones that are in the green are the things that you want to be aware of and continue monitoring, but you might not invest a lot of time and effort in terms of management of those. And so I can't even remember, I should have asked the ladies here this beforehand, but how many different parameters we ultimately identified as potential risks along the way. I want to say my recollection was probably about 40-ish. Yeah, different types of risks, and they would all be related to a whole bunch of different topics. Runoff from agricultural lands, from feedlots, from oil and gas, from spills along highways, a whole bunch of different potential risks along the way there. But looking at the ones that are specific to the group here, there were 4 very fuzzy risks identified here with road salts. And so really it boils down to the risks of over-application of road salts, sand and salt to roadways, and of course the runoff that comes off of that. On the urban side of things, that would apply, of course, because the city, we would put down sand at intersections to try and gain traction. So that's one of the items there. In terms of our snow storage facilities, so you'd have commercial properties that are cleaning off their parking lots. They would take that snow. We'd have municipal roads that would be taking snow off those roads and putting them into snow storage sites. And so the runoff coming from those facilities there, generally there's no treatment involved in that, so we want to identify, well, what's the relative risk of runoff from those snow storage facilities. And then related to that, the stormwater, because there is no, typically there is no treatment for the chlorides that are along the way there, what is that impact downstream? So you can see that through the process, the top table is dealing with the urban risks. On the bottom table, we identified what are the rural risks. And in the end, they also identified that application of sand and salt to the roadways is also a risk out in the rural environments, just like it is in the urban environments. But ultimately, if you look at the numbers there, you can see the very top line for on the city side, on the urban side, it ended up being in the red. Whereas on the rural side, it only ended up being in the yellow. And that was because there's fewer intersections that this is being applied to, as opposed to in the urban environment where it's a lot more frequent, and the concentrations and the potential impact would be higher accordingly. I should point out, just along the right-hand side, this is a map from Camrose County. Anjah provided this. Don't expect to be able to read that. It is the overlay of the Camrose County map. The effective drainage area is now shown in brown, and then the very dim parts that you can't really see very clearly, those are the specific locations that the county has identified as intersections or key locations that they will potentially be doing application of sand with salt, just to gain that traction. And that's a map that the Camrose County would review and update periodically as well.
So just wanted to mention also here that once the advisory committee had completed their risk assessment, we did want to get a broader public consultation process going, just to gauge if we were on track, if there was anything that we had missed, validating the results of the committee's work and seeing what the local community was feeling about these various things. And we did this through an online survey that people could fill out. There were about 85 people, both city and county residents overall, that responded to that survey. And one of the questions that we asked the respondents to answer was asking them to identify the level of risk to source water quality that they saw associated with a number of both those rural and urban activities. And overall, about 76% of respondents identified the rural transportation-related activities as moderate to high risk, and then 78% of them identified urban dust and ice control measures as being of that moderate to high risk. And then on a similar vein, just change my paper. We asked survey respondents to identify the importance of a number of those rural and urban management practices. So looking first at the risks and then their perspective on those management actions that would be helpful in protecting source water quality. And both, so 83% and then 90% of respondents identified those environmentally friendly dust and ice control measures as being moderately to very important in both those rural and urban areas. So just an overall sign that people were thinking in a similar vein to us, that these types of dust and ice control measures and better beneficial practices in those areas were seen as a very high priority.
So based on all of the information that we've talked about so far, when we wrote the Camrose Source Water Protection Plan, transportation became a key issue, and linear developments and roadways and railways were mentioned, and talking about how we salt, silt, and maintain those, especially adjacent to those water bodies, came up as an important thing to be considering. And based on that, we suggested that the county and city look at their snow control measures and how they're dealing with dust control, especially in environmentally sensitive areas. And that became a recommended management plan. So that I'll just read out to you. It is recommended that the City of Camrose and Camrose County investigate alternative dust and ice control options, balancing both ecological and economic considerations. The city and the county should also adhere to the best practices related to dust and ice control. application and incorporation. So that was something that going forward, it was a medium-term issue, but it was in the red, so it's something that both the city and the county took fairly seriously in part of their management processes. And then the other recommendation that came out of there is that the city and county implement actions to reduce water quality impacts on roadways and walkways that cross the natural water bodies, and implement those best practices, again, related to sand, salt, and other contaminants from entering the stormwater system. So again, that shows up a couple of times in these documents as very important to the community members. So what we did is implementing this tool is, this became because it's a political issue for us, we decided that we would implement it as a non-binding voluntary document and used for guidance that would prioritize our management actions and serve as an education tool for our ratepayers and also those people that are in our public works and those departments that are applying that road salt and dust control. So we encouraged all of our ratepayers and people to use this to determine how we're going to utilize those resources. So for our public works department, going back to that map where we were showing where we dust control, we reviewed each of those. That's actually an old map where we're doing those sites and where we're providing salt in the winter to determine, do we need to provide salt and dust control at every one of these intersections? And if so, do we need to do it as frequently as we are doing it? And if there's any other way that we can change that. So it was really important to us to keep monitoring that, especially in the areas that were highlighted as being part of the effective drainage area. So obviously we can't just say we're not going to do calcium chloride and we're not going to do salt in the winter. It's an important road safety issue. So we're always trying to balance those two things out when we're talking about these documents. But it is something that they are now thinking about on a regular basis, about where do we apply, when do we apply, what do we apply, and getting into that. In 2019, we did actually change our pickled sand. So starting in 2019, we are now using a manufactured sand rather than a natural sand. Manufactured sand, I am not the public works engineer guy, I'm gonna look at you or you, is more gritty, so you don't need as much salt in it to make it function as well as natural sand. So what the impact of that is we were able to change the amount of salt in our sand from 8% to 6.5%. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, for us that is 10 tons of salt a year that we're taking off the roads that we, before 2019, were putting on the roads. So it is reducing the amount of salt that we're using. And the City of Camrose is buying their sand from us, so they're also reducing their amount. And in 2021, we constructed a covered sand shed to prevent runoff from the pickled sand as well. So that's something that we didn't legally need to do, but it was something that we felt was important. Our shed is in the middle of the city industrial park, so it's not really out in some of those other areas, but as Jeremy said, that area would be considered part of the effective drainage area of Dryden Meat Lake, because pretty much all of the city is part of that effective drainage area. So, and then again, we tried to reduce the number of places and times that we're doing some of that snow clearing and sanding and dust control. We don't have any control over the private dust control, although again, this is an educational tool, so we'll often tell landowners, you know, do you really need to provide 300 meters of dust control in front of your yard, or is there an alternative? Now that they're not getting a discount, there's less people doing it. We used to subsidize that. That's another way to cut your both your expenses and the amount of dust control, is to stop subsidizing it. The county is also continuously reviewing again where we're putting that stuff, and again keeping in mind that road safety, but also looking at the other factors. And we've also done a lot of research around alternative products. I'm hoping somebody with more expertise will talk about that. We've looked at the brines and the beet juices and some of those, but they also have payoffs that we haven't quite decided were worth it. So at this point, we're still using standard sand, but we're always checking out the newest technologies on all of those things.
So next couple slides here are talking about what the city's been doing in terms of the implementation. And before I get into that, and I think that I've been hearing little bits and pieces in terms of road safety and things like that, but I just want, just to make sure everybody kind of is on the same page here. First, just wanted to start by saying, road safety is important, obviously. You know, if you're driving around in an urban environment and people are sliding through intersections and getting into car accidents, obviously that's not a good thing. In an urban environment like for City of Camrose, we have a number of locations that are located on hills. I can think of a number of locations where we've had semis spinning out in the middle of wintertime. And so if you don't have any sand on these locations there, you can end up creating a safety issue there. Typically, like the City of Camrose, we don't apply salt to our roads. What we use the salt for is to keeping our sand piles from freezing completely solid. There's a little bit of moisture that's in the sand, and ultimately if you didn't have any salt in there at all, you'd have a big sand berg, and you would not be able to actually, in the wintertime, take the sand out and apply it onto the roads because it would be completely frozen solid. So just to kind of set the stage in terms of typically on the urban environment, it was mentioned here before, really kind of two main areas. One would be the sand, which is pickled sand in our case, plus calcium chloride is another major potential contributor. On one thing I haven't thrown up here on the slides, but although it is kind of incorporated into the city's road winter maintenance policy as well as our dust control policy. The city really does not do calcium chloride. We don't do dust suppression in our back alleys, on our gravel roads. That's an area that's constantly being complained about by the adjacent property owners, as you can appreciate. You know, people are driving too fast, there's lots of dust. Why doesn't the city do it? Part of the reason is cost, and part of the reason is because the environmental concerns. So the city, I won't say we've never, and we would never, but that's part of our city policy is that we really do not do dust control within the community. Calcium chloride is one of the main types of dust control products that had been historically used by the city in the past. So as I mentioned there, the city does have a winter road maintenance policy. This is something that is regularly, I should say, reviewed and updated by administration and brought before City Council. It is a council-approved policy. Through that, what we've identified is relative priority levels within the city. And so for anybody that's familiar with Camrose, we have 48th Avenue or Highway 13 going right through the middle of the city, Camrose Drive, which is kind of the South Ring Road. Those would be areas that would be considered part of priority 1. We have a number of our collector roadways, areas that are on steeper hills, priority number 2. So the policy itself talks about not only the snow clearing, but also where we would apply sand, the pickled sand, to try and improve that road safety along the way there. So that's one of our governing policies is within the city is this the city winter road maintenance policy. Taking a step backwards here, the federal government has a guideline, or code of practice, I should say, that was approved in 2004. I looked on the website here just within the last couple of weeks. That is still the current version, as far as we can tell. So the 2004 code of practice, which talks about if you have any municipality that applies more than a certain number of tons of salt per year, that code of practice would then apply to it. The City of Camrose, as you can see there, we're approximately about half of that in terms of we're not meeting that threshold, and so technically the code of practice does not apply to the City of Camrose, and counties even less. But in 2008, we sat down and said, well, is there anything in the code of practice that makes sense for us before it's even legislated and required for the City of Camrose to comply? Is there anything in this code of practice that are kind of the low-hanging fruit, things that make sense for us to do, best management practices, essentially? And so we went through that process, had some outside assistance with a consultant to take a look at, what are some things that we potentially could do. We've tried to incorporate some of those, and then because again, it's not a requirement from the federal government at our point, we have to try and balance, okay, if it's legislated, then obviously we have to do it. We have to budget accordingly. But we always have to try and take a look at, okay, what's practical in this instance here? What makes sense? Again, what are those low-hanging fruits that we can apply? As Anjah mentioned here, in 2019, we had a change of our supplier of our sand. Thank you, County, for assisting with that. And getting back to, and I'm not in operations, so I won't know all the details and be able to answer it necessarily as some might be able to, but what's the difference between natural sand and manufactured sand? If you were to go out into a beach, if you go into a sand pit, if it's a natural sand, a lot of the time it's very rounded, it's been eroded, and so it's quite smooth. And so because of that, it's basically like putting little ball bearings on your roadway. You can actually create safety issues by having the wrong application of the sand. A manufactured sand is basically kind of like running it through a gravel crusher. And so as a result of that, you get a lot of really sharp edges and angles on it. And so because of that, you get a lot more traction than what your typical natural sand would potentially have. And so because we're adding more traction, you can actually use less of the material because you've got more grit in there. And as a result of that, because again, our sand is pickled, we can actually use, first of all, you can use less sand on the roadways than what you did before. But also the way that the manufactured sand sits in a pile, it's less prone to actually freeze up and stick together. And so as a result, as Anjah mentioned there, we were able to take the salt concentration in that pile down from 8% down to 6.5%. And so just looking at the amount of pickled sand that we use within Camrose, typically around 3,500 to 4,000 tons of sand per year, looking at the amount, because of that change from 8.5 down to 6.5, or 8% down to 6.5%, we were able to do a reduction of about almost 60 tons of salt per year. And then I've got another kind of a summary slide there that puts together the city and the county on the same screen there. The last item I wanted to flag here is the City of Camrose. We just recently, our grand opening for the new Public Works facility was less than a month ago. Over the last couple of years, we've been working on design and ultimately construction of a brand new Public Works facility. It's a new building on our existing site, but when we were doing the planning of that, we did, the bottom right corner is you can see the far right-hand side, there's a green couple rectangles there. That's our new office plus shop. And then when we were looking at the overall layout and design of the actual facility and of our Public Works yard, we didn't include it right now in the implementation, but that red boxed area there is a future covered sand salt facility. So right now it is still outside, but we've tried to at least plan for future implementation of a covered facility, very similar to what the county has just recently done on their site. So this picture here, before I get to the table, the picture that you can see, this is taken from inside the county's new covered facility. And so they've got their pickled salt, or pickled sand, I should say, is inside a covered facility there. So this is just a photo of that. Why do you want to look at options of covering it? Obviously, when you're applying the sand in the wintertime, it's exposed to the elements, and so having a covered facility makes things a lot easier for your operations staff to be able to work around with that. One of the main reasons, though, for having a covered facility is any of the pickled sand that's left over in the spring, it's exposed to the elements. And so anytime that there's a rainfall event, that rain percolates through, and you can have the salt leaching out of your sand and going immediately downstream. And so having a covered facility allows for basically that rainfall to go off and out around the sides of it, and you can actually keep your pile, whatever happens to be left over, basically you can keep it on site for the entire year, and then you'll top it up and bring in more sand, more salt, and mix up the next winter, but you don't have to dispose of what you've got. It's just a covered facility, and so you don't have to worry about that leaching out of there. So that's what it looks like from the inside. Just the table at the bottom right there, this is just to try and identify the overall savings. So from the city side versus the county side, and then the total savings there. So just a quick summary, between the city and the county together, between 4,100 and 4,700 tons of pickled sand per year. And as a result of that, mainly as a result of that change of the 8 to 6.5% between the city and the county together, upwards of 70 tons less salt that's used in a typical year. And with that, I'm going to hand things back to Sarah to finish off.
Yeah, so just wrapping up with a few big picture lessons learned through this project. really, first and foremost, it's amazing to have that cooperative foundation before launching a project like the Source Water Protection Plan and all of the implementation actions that follow from it. Having both City and County of Camrose willing to talk about watershed scale management practices, source water protection is a brilliant starting point. And then to have them carrying on the good work. Also having that strong shared goal with all of those stakeholders that are involved. And then really working together in that consensus model, working with an advisory committee as one example to build that grassroots bottom-up support for the work, recognizing that we are all contributing potentially to the issue as well as the solutions. So not splitting between rural and urban, but what can we all do together as a watershed community? And then yeah, education around the fact that, like we've been saying, a lot of the City of Camrose, for example, is a contributing area to the watershed. Even if you can't see the river or the lake, the fact that we can still very much significantly impact it from a little bit further distance removed. And that little changes can add up to create some lasting impact for source water as well as watershed protection overall. So I think I'll leave it at that unless you guys have anything else to add. Thanks for listening.